In Islamic tradition, there are certain phrases that are just foundational. They shape centuries of law, of theology. And today, we're going to dig into one of the biggest ones, a phrase that looks simple on the surface, but has been debated for more than 1,000 years.
Al-Kitab wa al-Hikmah. Now, the common translation is the book and the wisdom. Seems simple, right? But what if that easy translation and all the assumptions that come with it aren't telling the whole story?
And that's the heart of what we're exploring today. Is this phrase pointing to two totally separate sources of divine law, or is it talking about two sides of the same source? The answer to that question has literally shaped Islamic law for centuries.
Okay, so to really get into this whole debate, we first have to understand the traditional view, the core assumption that became the orthodox position for millions of people.
So the standard thinking goes like this. Al-Kitab refers specifically to the Quran, and al-Hikmah, which means wisdom, is understood to be the Sunnah, all the teachings and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. So you have two parallel, equally authoritative sources of law.
Now, this isn't just a single idea. It's actually a whole chain of logic built on a few key assumptions. For this explainer, we're going to zoom in on those first three because they form the linguistic bedrock for the entire structure. What does Kitab mean? What does Wa do? And what really is Hikmah?
All right, so let's start pulling at the threads of that chain. We're going to get right into the words themselves, starting with that very first link.
The whole thing kicks off with this idea that Kitab just means the book, as in the physical, compiled Quran that you can hold. But is it really that simple? In classical Arabic, the language the Quran was revealed in?
Well, it turns out that in classical Arabic, the word kitab is way more flexible. It can mean something that's been prescribed or decreed or appointed. So think of it less like a book with a cover and pages, and more like an authoritative instruction, a decree, or a legal writ.
And you see this dynamic meaning all over the Quran itself. In one place, Kitab is translated as a prescribed term. In another, it's a timed decree. Somewhere else, it's an ordination, or even a letter. In every single one of these cases, just translating it as book doesn't quite work, does it?
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The Quran itself sometimes seems to suggest that it's part of a larger concept called al-Kitab. One verse actually calls the Quran a detailing of the Kitab, which implies it's a specific explanation from a greater divine instruction, not the whole thing itself.
So this puts the traditional view in a real bind, a logical catch-22, if you will. Their whole argument depends on the word wa, or and, always separating two different things. But then what do you do with verses that talk about the signs of the Kitab and a clear Quran? See the problem? If wa always separates, then the Kitab can't be the same as the Quran. But if you insist they are the same, then wa doesn't always separate. You can't have it both ways.
Okay, so we've seen some of the cracks in that traditional argument. Now let's see if we can build a different understanding, one that actually solves some of these textual puzzles. And a huge clue is hiding in plain sight in just one tiny word of grammar. A verse mentions the Kitab and the Hikmah, and then says God instructs you with it, using the singular pronoun. It doesn't say with them, which is exactly what you'd expect if they were two separate things.
That little pronoun, that singular it, points to a totally different way of seeing this. In this view, Kitab is the big picture divine instruction, the writ, and Hikmah, the wisdom, isn't a separate thing at all. It's the wisdom contained inside that instruction. They aren't two sources, they're one source and its most important quality.
And this idea gets even stronger when you look at who else is given Hikmah in the Quran. Turns out it's not just for Prophet Muhammad. The Quran says wisdom was given to all the prophets, to Jesus, to David, and even to a wise man named Luqman who wasn't a prophet. This really throws a wrench in the idea that Hikmah can only mean the Sunnah of Muhammad. Okay, so if the text itself seems to open the door to this other reading, how in the world did the two-source idea become the standard view? For that, we gotta switch gears from analyzing the text to looking at the history. And the timeline here is super important. For almost 200 years after the Prophet's death, legal thinking in the Muslim world was pretty diverse. Jurists used the Quran, sure, but also their own reason, local customs, and precedent. But that all started to change around the year 820, when this brilliant and influential jurist named al-Shafi'i made a powerful, systematic case that Kitab wa Hikmah had to mean the Quran and the prophetic Sunnah.
And what's really fascinating is that al-Shafi himself basically said it was a judgment call. He wrote, quote, "I prefer the more obvious of the two readings." That tells us it was a choice, his preferred interpretation, not some universally agreed upon fact back then.
And the ripple effect from this was massive. It completely changed the game. Before al-Shafi, jurists had a whole toolkit of sources. Afterwards, the focus narrowed way down, lifting prophetic hadith up to become a primary source of law, right alongside the Quran, and kind of pushing other tools like independent reasoning to the side.
So when you boil it all down, the interpretation of just 3 little words, al-Kitab wa al-Hikmah, was a key part of reshaping the entire foundation of Islamic law, locking in a method that has pretty much defined Sunni Islam ever since.
And all of this leaves us with a much bigger question, one that goes way beyond just this topic. Is wisdom something separate, another text handed down to us? Or is it a quality that's already inside a text, waiting for us to find it? It really forces us to ask, what is the real relationship between a divine text and our human wisdom?